what is hidden under the Oracle of Delphi of ancient Greece? This is what it looks like today, but in antiquity, leaders and people would go there to have a prophecy, a prediction concerning their lives. Even Alexander the Great went to have a prediction about his conquests. And at that time, the oracle was not ready to meet him, so he dragged her out, put her on her tripod seat, and told her to then and there give him a prediction. And she said, "I am sure that whatever you put your mind to, you will accomplish," she said. But this is the oracle of ancient Greece. The Oracle of Delphi was one of the most famous oracles of ancient Greece and to the then known world. It's located in Delphi, which is about a 2-hour ride north of Athens by car. It's in the mountains. It's on the side of a mountain. It's considered the navel of the world by the ancient Greeks because, according to tradition, when the god Zeus left 2 eagles, one in the east and one in the west, they met in Delphi. It was dedicated to the god Apollo, and Pythia was the intermediary, the oracle, with whom the god communicated and gave the oracles, which were recorded. Every 4 years, the Pythian Games were held in honor of Apollo, and Angelos Sikelianos tried to revive them. In the same area, there was a primitive oracle from earlier times, in which the view of the earth, the Mycenaean era, was worshipped. Statues of the goddess have been found in the ruins of the temple of Athena, Pronia, meaning the of Providence, as well as that of Apollo. The reasons for the establishment of the oracle was the existence of a gap from which gases would be emitted, that is, volcanic gases, geological morphology there, and thus allowing people to go through a state of ecstasy. In time, more gods were worshipped along with the earth, and according to mythology, the guardian of the oracle was the dragon Python, who was killed by Apollo, a huge serpent, a snake. During the geometric period, the oracle came under the rule of Apollo, as evidenced by the change from clay female figurines to bronze men's. In the Iliad, it's mentioned as a rich and sacred place. Visitors seeking an amulet from Pythia were called goddesses, and according to the oracle ritual, they had to first purify themselves with water from the spring of Castalia, paying a certain tax, the so-called Pelanon tax, which was not the same for everyone, while they had to offer and sacrifice in the temple of Apollo, usually a goat. The animal did not have to have any defect, while the necessary omen for Pythia to be able to give an oracle was to start the animal to tremble after they had first wet it with cold water. Among the theologians, there was a hierarchy about who preceded the service. The first to be entitled to an amulet were the inhabitants of Delphi. They were followed by those who had been honored by Delphi with the prerogative, privilege, and then the rest. And in the last 2 teams, the series was arranged by lot. Now, what is it that exists under the Delphi oracle, this location? Pythia followed similar purification rituals. After some formal procession, she would go down to the so-called sanctuary, where she would hear the question from the priests who were in a nearby small place called Panotonianikos, and she then fell into ecstasy while the priest recorded and interpreted the words she uttered. The oracle was supervised by 5 men, each of whom belonged to one of the 5 large Delphi families called Dephkalionids. Now, if one of the very past articles I had read, Dephkaliona was actually Noah. In the Apocrypha of Moses, Moses says that Noah was the Dephkaliona of the Greeks. Dephkalos ionos means come good omen. And we know that the translation of Noah in Hebrew is man of good omen. It says so even in the Old Testament. And the original Oracle of Delphi was one of his daughters, his not stepdaughter, his daughter-in-laws. Okay, now they were called Lefkalionids. They were called saints, while their leader was a prophet. And initially, the oracles were given only once a year, on the 7th of the month of Visius, the birthday of Apollo. With the increase in the number of visitors to the oracles were given on the 7th of each month, except for the winter months, as then, according to the legend, Apollo left Delphi and went to the far north. Now, these oracles, whose nature became known to us both from inscriptions and from the works of ancient writers such as Herodotus, were a law for the Greek world of the time, making the oracle a kind of referee for very important issues, such as wars or colonizations, giving of such enormous power. The laws of Sparta, for example, were introduced by Lycurgus with the prestige of the oracle, while the colonies in Lower Italy were established by the orders of the oracle. We know that Rome was a colony of Athens, if people don't know. Rome was actually a colony of Athens around 600 BC. So, while the colonies in Lower Italy were established by her orders in the period of the 6th and 7th century BC, with the increase of interest in these new colonies, the Oracle of Delphi knew its greatest prosperity as several missions began after the predictions of the oracle. They honored Apollo as chief, while many took the name Apollonia. The oracles in ancient times were known for their ambiguous meaning. There were several times when the oracle did not take an impartial stance, but openly took the side of a faction, such as the Peloponnesian War, which took the place of the Spartans, the Lacedaemonians, instead of the Athenians, for example. However, her services were given to everyone, regardless of the political situation in the areas. The descriptions of the legend of the Delphi oracle concerning Pythia, or her communication with Apollo, through the fumes belonging to the realm of the unreal and perhaps the myth, according to some archaeologists. In 1892, French archaeologists began excavating the Delphi sanctuary to find evidence that the gas gap, a gap that emitted the volcanic gases, had emerged and created a channel of communication between Pythia and Apollo. But they could not find any to prove it, and so the legend remained in the realm of myth. Now, that's because there was a lot of earthquake and geological changes, and the gas routes have changed. So there was no more gas emissions from that area. But going back to the article, it was not until late 1990s that a team of an archaeologist, a toxicologist, a chemist, and a geologist supported the opposite. According to their theory, the navel rock on which Pythia sat and said her predictions between the fumes in her spells and ecstasies was just above a gap created by the slipperiness of the underground slabs, leaving a passage for gas fumes such as ethane and methane to rise to the surface of the soil and be inhaled by Pythia. This is called the omphalos, or the navel of the earth. What exists under the Delphic oracle? It's known that if one inhales a small amount of ethylene, it becomes euphoric, and hallucinatory visions are created. When Pythia was in the state of communication with Apollo, and questions and advice were asked, Pythia's answers were given incoherently. She was deluded and said inconsistencies. The priests of the sanctuary were the ones who translated, quote unquote, and gave some meaning to what she said. The answers of the oracle have always been wise and foresighted, and that is why the oracle was a respectable and so famous and integral element of the Greek way of life. What's not widely known, however, is that the late professor of archaeology and rector of the University of Athens, Spiridon Marinatos, in 1958 and 59 wrote an interesting study entitled Delphic Case and the Spirit of Pythia, which was the main topic of his rector's speech in the ceremonial hall of the University of Athens, in the presence of the then royal couple, King Pavlos and Queen Federiki, having in his hands tangible evidence for the evidence of the gap that was the communication channel between Pythia and the spirit, quote unquote, the spirit of the gods. He therefore preceded his findings by 30 years by foreign scientists. He says the latest science has ruled out the possibility of a gap because it was not discovered by excavations. But according to ancient testimonies, a gap existed. Theodoros Sikeliotis mentioned it first, and according to him, goats that grazed nearby discovered the properties of the gap because as soon as they approached it, they what's the word? They started skipping and jumping, hopping around, and had a very special type of a voice when they in their cryings, in their whatever the goats do when they all right, when they cry out. So their voice changed, meaning that it was all due because of they were somehow affected by these gases. Now, when their shepherd approached and bowed in curiosity into the gap, he was just as excited and began to predict the future. So, what can you say? The same happened to others who jumped into the gap and got lost, so the oracle became known, and it was thought that it belonged to the earth. A cave. Then there was the cave that was discovered. The author said that the gap was where the sanctuary of today's sanctuary is. However, Strabo says the same thing, adding that from the cave that was not wide, an enthusiastic spirit, quote unquote, was mentioned. Later writers talk about the incense vapor and fumes, the spirit of the subtle and fiery Lamblicus, the spirit of the cold. They say that Justin, and finally air was sometimes stronger and sometimes weaker. Pliny adds that the fumes were among the first of their kind, which created a divinatory state of inspiration. Of particular importance is the testimony of Plutarch, who was also a priest in Delphi for more than 20 years. In two of his essays on the stolen stores and on him, Pythian is not measured now. He talks about Delphic problems. He also mentions the gap in the air emitted that he inhaled. He had done this many times, but he never said that the gap was in the sanctuary of the temple. He also states that the fumes were not constant, but were sometimes weak and sometimes strong. It also invokes witnesses that the transmitted spirit is at intervals full of fragrance. Characteristically, he affirms that with this fragrance, the house in which those who waited for the oracle sat and came from the sanctuary was filled. And the way he talks about the inhaled air, this scent in the air of these chemicals, leads to the conclusion that this is not the sanctuary of the temple. Specifically, he treats the following phrase about the fact that Pythia no longer gives metrical uses, and in either case, Pythia does not approach the location where this essence of the fumes of the gods have been emitted, and her strength had disappeared. As the two of them, or of Pythia in the village of the non-maritime, in the name of the divine Esten, or of the spirit of the extinguished and the power of the electorate, he said. However, there is no talk of fumes, but of muses and namas. But we already know that with the sacred and original oracle of the earth, the fumes of the gap were connected. The sanctuary of the earth was discovered during the excavations there, exactly as Plutarch mentions, on the meridian side of the temple. And A. Keramopoulos, in the Guide of Delphi, 1935, states, it is the old sanctuary of the earth. Here was the gap between the breaths and the breaths. Okay, the emissions of the gases, he meant. Shortly after the construction of then the new hotel at the edge of the city of Delphi, I've been there, it's built from the road downwards towards the side of the mountain. Marianas heard during his transfer there in March of 1955 that they were talking about the wind hole, quote unquote, which was partially cut off by the road. And Keramopoulos spoke of a crack in the western end of the village, and he visited the spot. He found the gap, put his head in it, and immediately felt the breath of an outgoing wind. He photographed the spot and wrote an article in the daily press with which he recommended to the tourist service to take care not to further damage the gap. In January 1959, he returned to Delphi, but the gap had disappeared. During the new widening of the road, the rock exploded, and the part of the hole that was left was filled with stones and soil. However, he found the small remaining trace of the gap with the help of the old photograph, but again he doubted because the landscape had been dramatically transformed. As he characteristically writes, the final proof was provided by the fumes. The spirit has always been there, quote unquote, the spirit meaning the volcanic fumes. The spirit has always been there, coming out through the stones and earth. This time the heat was rising, and the heat became more intense on a cold day. So you've got geothermal activity there. Now, Marianas believed that the slit was one and only, which, going from east to west, passed through the sanctuary and sometimes emitted the fumes inside it, most likely in the sanctuary of the earth, and due to the continuous and severe earthquakes, the rocks probably underwent a slight movement, from which one mouth was blocked and another was opened by the windmill. And the water of Castalia Spring was moved many times in the past and in 1870 due to earthquakes. He also considered it possible for Anemotripa to be a branch of the Delphic Gap or even a completely independent gap. However, the fact remains that near the sanctuary there is this phenomenon about which antiquity has spoken, and it covers the various ways with which the spirit of Delphi, the gases, is described. Regarding the ancient sources of the gap, Marianas points out that they are not older than the 1st century BC. Diodorus, who was the oldest at the same time, gave rise to the challenge of the whole question of the gap and fumes because he mentioned that it was in the sanctuary of the sanctuary. In addition, the frequent expression that Pythia descended into the sanctuary led to a series of misunderstandings. It was considered the part of the temple behind the nave that in some ancient temples there was a separate apartment which was given the name sanctuary. The temple of Apollo in that part was excavated internally to the natural rock, which happened to be discovered solid and completely engraved. Undoubtedly, there was never a gap there because Pythia was coming down. They received 2 floors in the sanctuary of the temple due to the traces of stairs, but was this a sanctuary of the gap? Keramopoulos has already made the correct observation that inside the walls of the temple, they do not have a face in the excavated part, so it was never intended to be visible. Now, the Delphi of the past century, what exists under the Delphic Oracle? The earliest testimonies, which are all poetic, are vague and plausible, elastic interpretation. The relatively clearest version is Pind Ol, a goldsmith with a beautiful 6-pointed temple, now said, "Darker is the speech in Pythia, golden is the sacred tripod treasure in the coral of the sanctuaries below, Castalia Spring of the stormy neighbors. It is impossible to conclude which sanctuary Euripides means." Also in Eumenides or Ionas, the reader will get the following. In the temple there was a fly, quote unquote, there was the navel, there were surrounding thrones, since Pythias saw Eumenides asleep, and they were always in the space. Here is a statue of the god. Now everywhere there is an entrance and exit to the temple, and nowhere a descent, not even explicitly the sanctuary. So since the sanctuary of the temple did not show any traces of use in the deeper layers, we must consider whether the descent, which is attested to later sources, means another sanctuary outside the temple. Diodorus uses the phrase that the gap was in this place as it is now called the sanctuary. We observe then first that the sanctuary means not only the temple but also the whole sanctuary, the whole district, in direct contrast to the temple. Secondly, if it was a temple, it would not be necessary to use the phrase the so-called sanctuary, since the sanctuary was a regular name of the relevant department of the temples. And when we combine the news that Pythia prevailed in the sanctuary, we are led to the conclusion that it was outside the temple at a deeper point, probably around the sanctuary of the earth. Such sanctuaries within the temples in which they were dominated existed elsewhere in Greece, as in the sanctuary of the Isthmus, where inside the enclosure of Palemonas is engraved by Pausanias, quote, "In the left temple in the olden days, the old man was hiding," end quote. The ratio between the sanctuaries of the two sanctuaries is great, since in both descriptions a phrase, the so-called sanctuary, is used. In addition, in the traditions in the sanctuary of Delphi, Python was buried and in Isthmus Palemon. There's also the testimony of Herodotus. It's known that these gaps in the earth, as well as the relevant underground spaces, were called sanctuaries and mansions. Herodotus therefore mentions the oracle that the Athenians received in the wake of Xerxes' invasion, the Persians, that is, when they were invading Greece. The god worshippers, after performing the relevant ceremonies, lived in the mansion. Pythia then talks about the desperate catastrophe which hangs over Athens and ends up, quote, "at least out of the way," end quote. Therefore, mansions and sanctuaries are presented as synonyms, and most likely they were one and the same. In the vestibule where the foreigners were sitting in the background was the gap from where Pythia was giving her predictions. Plutarch's description is in complete agreement with these, with the only difference being that the space in which the gods of the god sat is called a house there. It is fragrant at times from the spirit of the adjacent sanctuary, fragrant meaning the geological gases. Now, according to Pausanias, the water of Kasoditos reached the sanctuary, and the drinking of it, which was one of the elements of the divination. So that water had, who knows what kind of gases it had in it. We do not know, or minerals, we do not know what and where Kasotis was. That's another spring. However, many traces of tanks and pipes were found, which from the 6th century BC led the water around the temple. Marianas argues that careful monitoring of these conduits may facilitate the discovery of the sanctuary and the gap. This is from Delphic Case in the Spirit of Pythia by Spiros Marinato of 2013, and I've translated this for you from a Greek article, Diadrastika, and that's for anybody who loves archaeology and wants to know what was going on with these predictions and prophecies of the Oracle of Delphi, Pythia. If you'd like to join me on my Patreon account, you will hear content not covered by mainstream media. These riveting stories will be based on my research, and I will state my opinions and give my personal insight on diverse and controversial subjects and world events not covered by mainstream media, and not supported by YouTube guidelines. So whatever I have on my Patreon, most of those will not be on my YouTube channel. Please consider becoming a member today. More of the most significant and important videos will be on my Patreon channel. Your support helps me to continue my research and keeps this YouTube channel alive. And we depend on your support, your generous charity, because we help economically challenged families here in Athens, Greece, in Kapota, and we also help the young generation with university tuition and the community around our church. Thank you.